It is the hour before sunrise, when the sky is more suggestion than colour, and the wind over the water keeps its own slow rhythm. From this quiet edge, I'll keep you company. We'll set out together with an easy pace, and the science will arrive like footsteps on soft ground. Tonight our theme is a visitor moving through the inner solar system. No alarms, no rush. Just the gently lit shapes of what we've seen, what we're measuring, and what might be learned as the days unfold. I'll speak in an even voice, steady enough to lean on, and you can let the rest of the world step back a little. If you'd like, slip on headphones, lower the lights, and set your phone to Do Not Disturb. You can follow the Sleepy Science playlist, so this kind of calm returns whenever you need it. Breathe once for curiosity. Breathe twice for comfort. I'll avoid hard edges. I'll trade headlines for horizon lines, and let each idea settle before the next one arrives. When we touch a number, we'll hold it lightly and place it where it can't keep you awake. When we meet a mystery, we'll give it room to be a mystery. You don't need to remember anything. I'll carry the thread. Your only job is to listen the way the sea listens to the shore, taking in and letting go. If sleep comes, that's part of the plan. The sky is brightening by a shade you can almost hear. Let your shoulders drop. Let the breath slow. The story opens now, one calm frame at a time, and the first quiet glimpse is waiting just ahead. Colours dissolving into morning as we begin. I begin with a calm definition, the way you might sketch a shoreline while the tide comes in. An interstellar comet is simply a traveller whose path is not bound to our sun. It passes through on a one-time visit and keeps going. Astronomers recognise that freedom by the shape of its track in space, a curve that never closes, the celestial equivalent of a long, unbroken breath. From there, the picture softens into parts. A small, solid heart we call the nucleus. A halo of dust and gas called the coma. And then the faint streamers that form when light and wind from the sun nudge the loosened material into long, slow veils. You do not have to hold the vocabulary tightly. Let the terms drift past like boats at anchor, steady enough to recognize when they return. News of a new visitor can sound sharp in daytime. Here, we round the edges. The comet now named 3I Atlas is the third confirmed object from beyond our solar system. It was first picked out by a survey made precisely for this kind of watchfulness, and the wider community stepped in to refine the path and confirm the origin. The consensus has been simple and reassuring. This is a distant passerby, not a hazard, and the interest it invites is scientific, not urgent. A moment to breathe. Imagine the hush of a mountain telescope dome before dawn, the sound of cables settling, the slow spin of a floor that keeps a mirror aligned with the sky. Down at sea level, a gull lifts once and lets the wind do the rest. Far above, a sensor gathers light that left the sun, touched a drifting halo, and returned across the dark. We are eavesdropping on gentleness. Seeing, in astronomy, is rarely a single glance. One instrument may cradle a faint smear of light and say, "There is motion here." Another, far above the weather, sharpens the smudge and separates glow from star streaks by tracking the moving target itself. The background blurs because the comet is the subject. That is why some early images look like a quiet teardrop floating past thin lines, and why those lines are not mistakes but proof of the method. Hyperbolic can sound like a word with corners, yet it is a smooth idea. If you were to trace the comet's path on an immense sheet, you would see a curve that never loops back. Gravity bends it, but nothing catches it. In practical terms, that means astronomers treat this as a one-pass story. We listen with care while the signal is strong, knowing it will fade. There is a comfort in that honesty, the way a tide tells you it will return, even as it slips away. Attention often shifts from "what is it?" to "what can we learn?" once the first images arrive. The coma's texture hints at grain sizes and gas. The brightness pattern whispers about the size of the hidden core. And the direction of any faint elongation can be compared with where the sun sits on the sky, to decide whether we are looking mostly at dust pushed outward or at geometry that plays tricks at certain angles. Each clue is modest alone. Together, they become a map that warms slowly in the mind. It helps to remember that comets are neither fragile myths nor indestructible stones. They are mixtures, ice that loosens under sunlight, dust that lifts and drifts, rock that keeps its shape a little longer. On some days the flow is brisk, on others it rests. Rotation makes certain regions wake before others, as if a dim lamp were carried around a room. That is why 2 nights of images can look different without asking for any drama to explain the change. Because this guest comes from outside our planetary family, there is an extra hush around each observation. Material formed under another star's story is now glowing in ours. Even at arm's length distances, that is close enough to teach. Spectra, those rainbow fingerprints, will tell us which molecules broke free and in what amounts. Photometry, patient measures of brightness over time, will hint at spin, shape, and surface patchiness. Astrometry, precise positions, will tighten the orbit like a quietly drawn bowstring. If you catch yourself trying to memorize, let that go. The path, the parts, the purpose, these are here to make the next images feel familiar, not to test you. Think of the comet as a soft lantern moving through a great room. Instruments are eyes adjusted to different corners of the spectrum. Together, they form one steady gaze, permitted to blink, permitted to rest, and ready to notice when a detail returns in a new light. Sometimes talk turns to origins. Which cloud, which nursery, which long ago scattering nudged this body into interstellar night? Those are beautiful questions, and they sit well in slow company. Our first task, though, is simpler and kinder to the night. Describe what is here, now, as faithfully and gently as we can. Let the larger story assemble itself from patient pieces, the way a shoreline reveals its curve when the tide has time to work. So we begin with a traveller on an open path, a halo around a hidden core, and the quiet agreement that looking closely is its own reward. I will carry the thread from one calm scene to the next. You can settle your breath and listen for the softest parts of the picture. The first quiet glimpse is enough for tonight's opening, and it will hold while we wade a little deeper. Before the mountain light wakes, the dome is already turning. The Nordic Telescope rides the slow arc with a patience that suits the hour, and I picture the mirror like a still pond catching a narrow ribbon of sky. When it settles on our visitor, the field looks spacious, a soft glow at center and quiet specks around. The streaking you sometimes see in images is not haste, but method, the camera following the comet so the fixed stars flow by. In that calm frame, a subtle elongation leans toward where the sun sits off-stage. Astronomers call this a sunward feature, and the language is cautious on purpose. Geometry can play small tricks when dust forms a thin sheet and our line of sight skims the plane. Yet, when directions line up within a narrow spread and the axis of the brightening agrees with the sunward bearing, the eye grows steadier. This is not a roar, just a pale thread holding its angle while Earth turns and instruments trade hands. Memory helps. A midsummer look from orbit saw something similar, a faint structure that didn't simply stream away from the sun. Between then and now, the traveller rounded its closest point and kept its form well enough for another comparison under different circumstances. When two separate teams, with different optics and distances, report closely aligned directions, the notion of repetition begins to matter, not as an answer, but as a rhythm, a motif that returns, softened by distance, familiar enough to hum along to without deciding what the song means. Why an image will show dust more than gas has a gentle explanation. Some filters collect light reflected by tiny grains and let many glowing gases slip past. Other filters do the opposite. The night from La Palma favoured dust, the heavier, slower motes that stay visible when the glow from molecules is tuned down. Think of brushing chalk powder from a sleeve under lamplight. You see the particles, not the air around them. And in that dust-forward view, the sunward brightening becomes a texture we can trace without forcing it to be more than texture. The wind hushes over the ridge. A few crickets hold the note. Inside the dome, the motors purr and then fall still, leaving only the faint tick of the guiding system and your own breath finding a slower lane. There is a quieter second clue in the same frame. On the far side from the sun, a weaker asymmetry tilts roughly along the anti-solar bearing, a lean that fits the expected push of light and wind, and it lives alongside the sunward thread without conflict. So a picture emerges in which two tendencies share the night. One faint arrow pointing back toward the star that warms it, and one leaning away, both present, both measured, both held together by the same halo of dust that drifts between them like the breath in a winter room, slow at first, and then slower still as the heater hums. What does that duet suggest? It suggests structure rather than chaos. It suggests sources on or near the nucleus that light up with some regularity, so that geometry today rhymes with geometry months ago. It suggests that the words we choose should stay small, while the data set grows large. When two features persist through different vantage points and different instruments, the night invites us to say, we see this again, and then rest there. Later work can untie which parts belong to dust sheets seen edge on, which to jets that keep their shape, and which to the patient illusions that viewing angles can paint. For now, we mark directions, we note their kinship with the sun's position, and we let the picture breathe. We can hold one more gentle frame. Imagine the observers logging angles and filter choices while the first bird calls from a dark tree line. Imagine the image header, full of small facts that will be footnotes by afternoon, and the glow at center still modest, still coherent, still keeping a line that points into the day. You do not have to decide what the line means. You only have to feel the calm of a repeated motif, the way a lighthouse repeats, not to argue with the sea, but to be reliable. We will come back to this scene with spectra and with time. For tonight, we file the directions gently and let the room dim another shade as the picture fades to the sound of the mountain wind. From Mars, the look was sideways. Between October's 1st and 7th mornings, spacecraft circling the red planet turned their instruments toward the traveler and watched it slip past the far horizon of another world. The geometry was simple and beautiful, not from behind, not from in front, but across the flow of dust and light, as if you stood at the edge of a road and saw the snow drift in sheets rather than head-on. Europe's orbiters, the veteran Mars Express and the ExoMars Trace gas orbiter, took their turns. On October 3rd, when the distance was on the order of 29 million kilometers, they measured and imaged from that offset perch. Side-on views do something our Earthline couldn't do in early October. They lay the coma like gauze across the frame, so any streamers show their length rather than their thickness. Even a modest feature becomes legible when seen along its long axis. Now picture another vantage. China's Tianwen-1, looping Mars on its own steady path, caught the interstellar guest on October 3rd and later released imagery. A bright core wrapped by a soft halo, moving where Mars hung as a dark coin in the foreground of thought. The release gave everyone a shared reference, a foothold for teams planning the next steps from Earth. The air over the deserts is still. Antennas listen. In the quiet, a generator thrum passes for weather. Inside control rooms, the light is low, and someone speaks softly so their voice does not startle the hour. We're not in a rush, we're listening for shape. NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, with its high-resolution camera, also looked. That camera, built to read the fine print of Martian terrain, can still sketch a distant passerby when the geometry lines up. From that week in early October, the expectation among observers has been for images with coarse but useful detail, tens of kilometers per pixel, enough to outline where any elongations lean relative to the Sun, enough to cross-check whether the motif we saw in midsummer returned from this different angle. Spacecraft cameras do not change their nature for comets. They simply offer what their optics and distance allow. Why do these sideways looks matter? Because a sunward brightening or an anti-solar lean can be confused, from Earth, by perspective that stacks sheets of dust along the line of sight. From Mars, the stack shifts. If a thin fan is really a fan, it should keep its direction when the viewing line turns. If it is an artifact of viewing geometry, the effect should wash out or rotate. A handful of frames, even if fuzzy by press image standards, can separate those two tails gently, without asking the data to do more than it can. There is also cadence in how information travels. Spacecraft make images, teams confirm pointing, pipelines calibrate, archives ingest, public pages appear. The steps exist to keep the record clean. Sometimes that rhythm feels slow against the tempo of headlines, especially when people hope a single picture will decide a question that truly belongs to weeks of spectra and months of follow-up. Here, the humane thing is patience. Let each agency move through its checklist and let the early releases from one vantage feed the planning for the next. Consider what a Mars-based angle can teach even without fine resolution. Suppose you mark the sun's direction on the frame and then draw the line along the brightest elongation in the coma. You compare the two and note how close the angles sit. You do the same for the fainter lean on the other side. Repeat across several images, and a map of directions emerges. No verdict, just a clean ledger of orientations that can be placed beside Earth-based notes and orbital ephemerides. This is the kind of modest arithmetic that calms a room. A further kindness of the Mars week is timing. Around perihelion, Earth's line of sight tucked the object too close to the Sun for comfortable work with many ground telescopes. Mars had a better seat for a few days, enough to keep the thread unbroken while Earth waited for separation to grow. Think of it as a friend holding your place in line while you step out to breathe. When the sky opened again from our side, the notebook was not empty. It held a few careful lines from orbiters in a different sky. You might be wondering whether any of this hints at more than geometry, whether a sideways view can weigh in on causes. Only gently. It can say that a feature repeats under a different parallax, which makes a dust sheet seen edge-on more or less likely. It can time variations against rotation, if multiple looks spread across hours show a change in the lean. And it can provide a baseline for spectra taken later, so that when a gas line appears at a certain speed, we know which direction the dust was tending and whether the two stories rhyme. That is already a great deal for 1 week's work. In the end, what Mars offered was a calm interlude of perspective. Not the sharpness of a postcard, but the value of a different seat in the same hall. The traveller crossed the Martian sky, orbiters traced its glow, and the ledger of angles grew by a few careful entries. Back on Earth, the telescopes would soon return to their vigil, the way an orchestra regathers after a pause, breath in, breath out, then the same theme played with new colour. Let that colour settle now, soft as dawn, along the rim of a red world, and let it dissolve into the next quiet frame. On the 8th of November, 3 careful observers combined their night's work into a single, hushed portrait. Multiple short exposures, aligned on the moving glow, were stacked until the noise sank and the shapes held. In the finished frame, slender brightenings radiated from the core like threads laid out on dark velvet. Not 1, not 2, but several, each keeping its own lane across the faint halo. The feeling was less of discovery trumpeted than of embroidery revealed under a lamp, brought close, a quiet unveiling that asks you to lean in and breathe slower. Comets can do this without drama. When sunlight loosens ices, gas expands and carries dust through small openings at or near the surface. Local topography guides the flow, so discrete plumes appear where cliffs, pits, or cracks turn gentle heating into focused release. As the nucleus rotates, some jets blink in and out, and others seem to swing, giving the impression of a bouquet that rearranges itself through the night. Nothing in that picture needs unusual language. It only needs time, a steady track, and a willingness to let small differences add up. Yet the sevenfold feel of this image draws the eye to how narrow some features remain. Diffuse fans look like breath on glass. Narrow plumes keep an edge, a reminder that grains and gas can start in a tight stream before they soften. Seeing both in one frame, A soft haze and a few brighter filaments give us contrast to measure. The filaments read like pencil lines over watercolor, and that contrast is what makes angle tracking so restful. You can follow a line to its direction without forcing it to be more than a line. The observing room is nearly dark. A kettle ticks. Someone pulls a curtain an inch to hush a stray reflection. On the screen, the halo blooms and fades as stretches are adjusted, and outside the building, the gravel keeps its cool undershoes that pass only once each hour. Far away, a coastal swell lifts and lays the same sheet of water, breath after breath, and a low wind combs the pines without hurry. Between sounds, there is the friendly quiet that instruments make when they are simply working. No alarms, no new files arriving for a minute or two, just the faint fan tone of cooling, and the sense that the night is doing its job. If rotation were smearing light into false filaments, the angles would wander. Watch from start to finish, and you would see the brightest lines tilt as the nucleus turns. Instead, the clearest threads in that November stack keep their bearings across the combined set, within the limits of the processing. That steadiness suggests sources that persist over the observation window, whether they are vents that happen to face us or fans we view nearly edge on. It is a simple test, and its answers are gentle. Mark the directions, compare them frame to frame, write down how much they drift. Stacking deserves its own moment of care. To catch a moving target, images a line on the comet itself, letting stars slip into short lines. Then they add the frames so the signal rises where the comet is, and randomness falls where it is not. That choice clarifies faint structure, but can also exaggerate edges if the alignment or background model is off by a hair. The safeguard is repetition. Multiple stacks from independent datasets, similar angles found by different hands, and a willingness to show raw frames when a feature seems too tidy for comfort. In this case, the tidy parts and the messy parts live together, and that balance keeps the picture honest. There is also a quiet lesson about scale. The threads look close and deliberate, but each spans thousands of kilometers before the night swallows it. Dust grains launched close together can stay neighbors for some distance before the solar wind and radiation pressure spread them. Gas glows and fades depending on filter choice and distance. What feels like order in a small region can be the calm center of a broader, softer flow. The image, read gently, invites both views at once. Embroidery near the core, snowfall farther out. To weigh the causes, we will want spectra and time. If dust dominates, the brightness will follow sunlight and geometry, and the gas lines will be modest. If gas dominates, we should see emission at familiar wavelengths, with widths that whisper of temperature and motion. And if any plume carries unusually fast material, line profiles can hint at that too, though most natural flows live in patient ranges set by gentle heating. Matching those signatures to the angles in the image turns a picture into a test, and a test into a lullaby where answers arrive by degrees. For tonight, the takeaway is soft. Multiple threads appeared together, some sharper, some hazier, all sharing one halo. Their angles rhyme with earlier hints from other nights, and their steadiness across the stacked set argues for repeatable sources rather than a fluke of processing. That is structure, which is not the same as conclusion. We will keep marking directions, keep listening for changes, and let the shoreline hush of the data draw its own curve while we rest beside it, content to hear the tide speak in a language of small, reliable returns. Radio gives the night a different texture. Instead of brightness on a canvas, we listen for lines at set frequencies where familiar molecules hum. For comets, one of the calmest voices belongs to OH, a fragment that forms when sunlight breaks water apart. Astronomers point dishes and arrays toward the halo and watch for those narrow notes. When the notes rise above the hush, we learn that water is there, not by sight, but by song, stretched across space with remarkable steadiness. Reports this month spoke of the first detections for our traveller. The instrument was a southern array, tuned to the band where OH often glows. The signal was not a message. It was chemistry doing what chemistry does under light. Hearing that simple chorus is like turning on a small lamp in a large room. You immediately know where the furniture sits, even if the edges remain soft for now. Water doesn't last long in sunlight near a star. When a molecule of water wanders into the glow, photons kick it apart, leaving OH among the pieces. Those fragments, in the right conditions, can amplify their own radio whisper. The result is a gentle line close by its twin, a matched pair that radio astronomers have learned to trust as the breathmark of a comet's coma. Measure the strength across days, and you can sketch how much water is leaving the nucleus, not in a single guess, but in a cadence that follows the object's spin and the sun's slow change in angle. Radio is kind to sleep because its pictures arrive as numbers first. Arrays gather streams of data and fold them over on themselves to make the faint stand up from the floor. Calibration is unhurried. Comparisons with blank sky fields take their turn, and plots bloom in quiet colours that do not need to shout. You end with a line that rises above the baseline by just enough to be believed by careful people. And that is another thread to weave with what the eyes have seen. A kettle breathes and clicks. In the control room, a sleeve brushes a notebook and the page makes that soft paper sound. Outside, dew settles on handrails and the steel remembers cold from last night. A distant jackal calls, then thinks better of it. The monitors keep their slow roll, thin white traces edging upward and then flattening again, like waves that forgot how to break. What does radio add that images cannot? Velocity, for one, because lines shift with motion. Temperature hints, because width and shape carry the imprint of agitation. Composition, because each species keeps to its own neighbourhood in the spectrum, letting water's child speak where carbon's cousins do not. When our optical colleagues see a thread leaning sunward, the radio team can ask whether the OH is stronger when that thread brightens, or whether the chemistry stays steady, while dust writes its own story across the frame. Schedules have their own music. Arrays book time months in advance and tip their dishes to share a sky with many projects. The comet rises, but other targets rise too. Weather takes its share, hardware another, and downlinks move at the speed of sensible caution. If a line appears tonight, its best fit numbers may not be ready for a week. If a line disappears tomorrow, the reason may wait for the next clear slot. Patience is a kindness we give both to the sky and to ourselves. The plan, as always, is to cross-check. O-lines near 18 centimeters say, water lived here today. Optical spectra say, which other gases kept it company. at what speeds, and in what proportions. Imaging says where dust chose to flow, and photometry says whether the spin and the sunlight agreed on when to lift more. When those four stories rhyme, we move our confidence up a notch with no need for grand declarations, just a ledger that grows tidy, page by page, with consistent entries that match across instruments and nights. If later data show surprises, we will be ready for them. A line wider than expected could argue for faster motion in a patch of the coma. A shift that waxes and wanes with a period could trace rotation more cleanly than a light curve will. A mismatch between radio strength and dust. Brightness could tell us that small grains and gases are taking different routes through the halo. None of these would be a verdict by itself. Together, they become a map with better contour lines, a softer slope, from perhaps to very likely, that lets the mind rest while the evidence gathers. For now, the soundscape is enough. A confirmed whisper where we expect water's child to sing, a cadence that keeps time with the comet's slow turn, and an agreement to listen again from multiple longitudes as the season turns toward December. Picture a small lantern set farther back in the room as you lie down. The light dims, but the space is still navigable, and the path between chair and door stays clear. That is radio's gift tonight. A way to see without looking, a way to measure without pressing, and a way to end the day with one more quiet piece that fits. Non-gravitational acceleration is a gentle phrase for a simple idea. If a body exhales material, the body feels a nudge in reply. Astronomers look for that nudge as a tiny drift from the path gravity alone would draw. It shows up as residuals that repeat, small and consistent across careful fits. Think of a quiet canoe adjusting course when someone trails fingers through the water for a while. The paddlework subtle yet legible when you step back and compare tracks over many strokes. The size of that nudge is tied to how quickly material leaves and how confined the flow begins. Natural outgassing. Near this distance from the sun usually launches molecules at a few hundred meters per second. Dust hitches a ride and slows with time, the larger grains coasting longer than the fines. None of this needs exotic wording. It is the familiar rhythm of ice warmed, gas expanded, dust lifted. In the ledger of numbers, the first row often reads sub-kilometer per second outflow, a calm range that captures most comets seen in similar light, while leaving room for the occasional brisk day, when activity concentrates along a sunlit rim for a turn or two. Across that flow, the solar wind keeps its own tempo. Charged particles stream outward from the sun far faster than comet gas expands. Their momentum sweeps the finest grains and shapes the larger story at a distance. Where the two meet, a kind of standoff emerges, a place where outward breath and inward breeze balance. You can imagine two curtains moved by opposite drafts in a long hallway, and somewhere between them a soft and temporary stillness forms, in which the fabric neither advances nor retreats, only wavers and holds for a moment that can be measured if your eye is patient. From such pictures, people try arithmetic. Ram pressure is momentum density, and momentum density is mass times velocity squared per volume. If you guess one side from spacecraft and solar physics, you can bound the other with the distance where dust seems to pause. The result is not a verdict. It is a bracket with generous margins. because each term carries its own uncertainty: grain sizes, launch angles, gas-to-dust ratios, the degree to which a thin sheet masquerades as a tight plume when seen edge-on, the exact way filters favor solids over glow. The honest answer arrives as overlapping bands, rather than a single, shiny point that would only promise more precision than the night has truly given us. Sensitivity tests are the kinder step between a first pass and a firm claim. Change the assumed grain size, and the standoff shifts. Change the launch cone, and a measure of column density turns into a family of possible densities. Let rotation move the vents, and the daily average can differ from a single hour's snapshot. In practice, we try many combinations and keep the ones that fit both the images and the faint accelerations in the orbit, the way a tailor lays several patterns on a bolt of cloth and chooses the cut that honors the fabric without forcing it to become something it is not. New measurements will help tighten those bands without turning the room loud. Line widths from spectra will tell us the distribution of speeds down where the flow begins. Ratios of species will hint at how energy is shared between gas and grains as they part. Time-resolved images will set limits on how quickly a feature turns with the body and how long it keeps an edge before softening. Even the simple habit of marking where a brightening stops from frame to frame can bound how dense the dust must be to hold its line against the wind, giving us a soft ruler we can reuse when nights and instruments change, yet the motif returns in familiar geometry. Because this is a traveller from outside our family, caution remains a kindness. We do not ask one image to carry all the weight, and we do not let one late-night calculation claim more than it earns. Small accelerations in the orbit are notes, not symphonies, and ranges in outflow speed are scales, not songs. The practice is to combine them and listen for harmony that stays when the temperature of the data changes and when another team plays the same line in a different key. If the harmony holds through December's spectroscopy and the weeks that follow, confidence rises a notch in the quiet way that helps both the mind and the story rest. For tonight, let the numbers keep soft edges. There is a measured nudge that sits where outgassing would place it. There are outflow speeds that match the comfort of ordinary heat at this distance. There is a wind from the sun that meets that breath farther out and draws a boundary we can watch without insisting it decide more than it can. And there is a plan to trade guesses for bounds, bounds for estimates, and estimates for understanding, at the pace of trains that pass in the night far from town, their hum receding, their rhythm predictable, their comfort not in arrival, but in the knowledge that the schedule is steady and the track is clear. Perihelion is the calm name for a bright moment. It is the part of an orbit when a body passes closest to the sun, and every surface faces more light than before. Heat rises, ices loosen, and outflow tends to peak. The path bends, but the story continues. Think of a stone bridge over a slow river. The midpoint is where the arch is shallowest, the view widest, and yet your footsteps never hurry, because the other side is simply the same road resumed with warmer stones beneath your shoes. After that turn, telescopes found the traveller again. Images taken once the glare eased showed a single central peak, not a scatter of separate cores. The halo remained coherent. Any filaments rode outward as one arrangement. A post-perihelion frame is not a verdict, but a steady peak at center is the way a night sky says still one body, in a language of brightness and distance and patient focus over minutes that feel like hours to the people guiding the mount. Other comets have taken a rougher path. One broke into a train, and years later, those pieces fell into a giant planet's clouds like beads drawn onto a thread. Another faded and frayed near the sun, its nucleus missing by the time the light returned to ground-based eyes. A third promised a show and then unraveled at perihelion, leaving only the suggestion of a curve where a core might have been. These are not warnings tonight, only reminders that intact is something we observe, not something we assume, and that survival through heat is a thing a comet earns one quiet evening at a time. No fragments seen is different from no fragments exist. Resolution sets the size of what we can separate. Contrast sets how faint a companion we might miss beside a bright core. The inner coma hides and reveals by turn. Absence is informative only when we name the limits. This small, this close, this dim, and under these filters that prefer dust over glow, we would have noticed another point of light if it were there. And because we did not, we move the probability toward single, without letting it touch certainty. The next checks are practical and kind. High-resolution imaging looks for a hard point at center, and anything that walks away from it with time. Light curves listen for a steady rhythm that a solitary rotator would keep, or for a mixed rhythm if two bodies were crossing paths within the same halo. Spectra watch where the gas lines swell and lean in ways that argue for one geometry over many. Astrometry narrows the orbit until small. Sustained pushes either remain small and sustained, or resolve into separate stories that need their own lines in the ledger. The dome whispers as motors settle. A cable ticks softly where chill meets warm air. Beyond the ridge, dry grass leans and returns, like a chest remembering how to breathe when the room grows quiet. A pencil point darkens the margin of a notebook and pauses there, as if the graphite were listening too. Somewhere below, a door hushes closed as hands carry two cups safely through a gap of darkness toward the gentle glow. If all of this continues to say one, we will accept it with the ordinary grace good data deserves. A single peak across several nights, a rotation pattern that holds its period, and a haze that brightens and calms in step with sunlight would make a plain case. If a contradiction appears, we will follow it the same way, because an honest mismatch between methods is how a question becomes precise. Either way, the work is slow by design. It protects the mind from chasing an answer faster than the answer can safely arrive, the way you shield a candle with your palm while a draft explores the room. So for this evening, let intact mean what it can and no more. A bright center keeps its place. The embroidery of the halo remains a single piece. The figures we add tomorrow will sharpen the outline without changing the tone. And as the night thins, we will cover the candle with a glass, watch the flame soften into a point, and let it go out without smoke. Two possibilities sit side by side on the workbench, and neither asks for drama. One says the glow and threads are ice at work. Sunlight loosens molecules, gas expands, dust rides the flow, and the coma shapes itself under slow forces. The other says some part of the flow is driven. Exhaust leaves faster, in narrower streams, as if a device were shaping the plume. Our task is not to vote, but to listen for signatures that belong to one score or the other. Where the lines of evidence overlap, we rest. Where they pull apart, we mark the place and return with better tools. Natural outgassing draws from familiar physics. At these distances, gas born from warmed ice tends to leave at a few hundred meters per second, and dust near the source can appear filamentary before softening. Spectra favor certain notes: water's fragments, carbon-bearing cousins, simple species that glow in narrow bands. Line widths stay modest, and shifts reveal speeds that match gentle heating and rotation. The morphology breathes with sunlight and spin, and direction changes arrive like tides rather than like switches flipped in an instant. A driven plume would announce itself differently. Exhaust could move kilometers per second instead of fractions, pushing line centers farther and broadening profiles beyond thermal comfort. Ionized species might dominate, or appear unusually orderly, if fields were shaping the flow. Brightening and dimming could step rather than drift, as if a valve opened or a throttle eased. And in images, collimated threads might hold edges longer than dust usually can, their bearings adjusting in patterns that speak more to guidance than to sunlight alone. Time and direction carry a great deal of weight. On one November night we saw several threads at once, as if a small starburst had been drawn with a steady hand, and earlier and later frames from other vantage points placed a persistent sunward lean beside a more ordinary anti-solar glow. If those directions repeat with the body's turn, natural vents can explain much. If they reorganize in quick, coordinated ways that ignore the rhythm of rotation, the case for control grows. Most nights, the sky prefers the middle, where slow geometry and patient heating do most of the talking. That is why we chart angles, not just impressions, and why we fold each new measurement into the ledger instead of rewriting the page. December's window is where these notions learn their manners. Spectrographs will split the light and weigh how fast different species move. Images will map the inner coma to see whether narrow filaments keep their edges. Photometers will track the pulse of brightness to time, any changes against rotation, and precise positions. Night after night will tell us whether small pushes are steady, whether they drift with sunlight as natural jets do, or whether they resolve into brief, directional nudges that resist the simple stories we prefer. Then the separate threads from radio, optical, and astrometry can be laid together on one clean table to see whether they weave, without strain, into the cloth of ordinary comet behavior, or whether some seams refuse to meet unless we allow for a firmer hand on the plume. Confusion is not failure, it is a cue to slow down. An edge-on dust sheet can mimic a tight jet, and filters that favor solids over glow can hide important pieces of the song. Processing choices can sketch hard borders where reality is softer, while limited resolution can smooth a structured flow into a single line. Even non-gravitational drifts can be shared among several vents and still look like one push if we do not sit with them long enough. The cure is repetition across methods, patient cadence, and a willingness to let two good explanations share the room until one of them tires under the weight of new, quiet facts. So we hold both models with open hands. Ice and light can paint almost everything we have seen, and engines, if engines belong here at all, would have to clear a high bar of measurement to justify their place in the story. Between now and the deeper looks ahead, we keep our language small and our notebooks tidy. Let the numbers arrive in their unhurried way. Let the angles keep their rhythm, and let the mind find comfort in a question that doesn't need an answer before dawn. When the moon leans west and the room cools by a shade, we will set the tools down and let the night close like a soft door. Statistics feel sharp in daylight, so we round them a little here. In surveys, unlikely often means rare within the set we actually notice, not impossible in the world. Telescopes do not sample the sky evenly, and pipelines promote certain things to our attention. A new interstellar traveller found by wide-field searches is both a discovery and a lesson about what our nets are shaped to catch. When we speak of chances, we should whisper about baselines, sensitivities, and the simple truth that we are best at finding what passes through the places we constantly watch, the way beachcombers bring home shells from the tide line they walk most. Alignment with the ecliptic sounds special, but detection has a bias toward that thin band. Many survey fields live there, because asteroids, comets, and planets keep the highway busy. A traveller whose track skims the plain spends more nights in our habitual view. That increases the odds not of its existence, but of its discovery. The geometry looks like luck at first, and like logistics after a second cup of tea, because what we scan most often is where our catalogue fills fastest, and the sky gently repays attention with a higher count of familiar lines to trace. Close approaches can raise eyebrows, yet close in space is roomy in comfort terms. A pass tens of millions of kilometers from a planet is a postcard, not a handshake. Orbital mechanics also bunch opportunities in the same classrooms. The planets already share one broad plane, and trajectories that cut that plane have more chances to meet schedules and be noticed. A single object can therefore seem to thread a needle by nearing more than one world, while in fact it is following a lane where needles are arrayed along the same table. The trick is to translate surprise into scale, and then scale into calm. Big numbers stretch the distances back into their proper size, so curiosity stays, while alarm retires. Timing around perihelion brought another coincidence that softens under geometry. From Earth, the visitor hid in glare for a spell, which made headlines rud like a curtain had been pulled. Yet, from other seats, Mars orbit, solar observatories, the stage remained in view. The fact that our biggest ground telescopes paused said less about secrecy than about how close the line to the sun had grown. When elongation is small, safety and practicality ask optical eyes to rest, and so our story leans for a week or two on spacecraft whose vantage points keep night, where our day presses too near. A rhythm emerges in which our attention handoffs are staged by angles rather than by intrigue, and the same sky writes several lines at once, so the ledger remains continuous, even while one pen leaves the page to breathe before it resumes. Multiplying small probabilities can be a useful exercise, and a slippery one. Independent events rarely stay independent when the way we look favors certain patterns. A survey tuned to moving light will inflate the share of fast or aligned things in our sample, and then our math surprises us by calling those alignments rare. Add in the way stories travel, how unusual pictures get more attention, and the apparent unlikeliness grows, not because nature changed, but because selection and storytelling amplified what we could already see. The cure is to fold in the design of the net, the cadence of the search, and the sober rule that we notice the bright, the near, and the conveniently placed more readily than their quiet siblings, who pass at awkward hours and angles and are lost to us without ever having been rare. So we count slowly. We let unlikely describe a model's expectation, not a verdict on reality. We admit that the corridor where planets travel is also where our instruments linger, and that travelers who enter that corridor will inherit more of our attention. We hold the arithmetic with an open palm and return to observation, where each entry in the ledger either nudges a curve or leaves it be. Then, like shells clicked one by one along a string, the numbers will find their spacing, and the tide will speak in its even way until the room grows quiet again, and you can hear only the low breath of the sea beyond the dark dunes. Names can tangle when the night is busy. A new November object entered the ledgers as C2025 V1, and headlines paired it with the discoverer's surname already famous from an earlier interstellar visitor years ago. That echo was enough to stir theories that this November find must be part of the same story as our traveller. It wasn't. What we actually have is a separate comet with its own path and its own uncertainties, arriving in the same season and borrowing attention by coincidence rather than by design. The way two boats pass the same buoy at different hours and only look related from the pier where gossip travels faster than tide. The clean way to separate stories is geometry. Orbits live in planes, and planes have tilts, so inclination tells you which sheet of space an object keeps. Eccentricity, meanwhile, tells you whether the path closes like an oval or opens like a one-time curve that won't return. These are modest ideas. When the preliminary elements for C2025 V1 show a steeply tilted track and a near parabolic or slightly hyperbolic shape, and the elements for 3I Atlas show a retrograde sweep near the planetary plane, you are already dealing with paths that do not share a classroom, much less a desk, and any meeting would require a set of circumstances that orbits alone do not provide. Rendezvous is not a wish, it is a budget. If two bodies do not already pass within the same small neighborhood at the same time, closing the gap demands change in velocity, and the number is rarely kind. For comets driven by sunlight, non-gravitational nudges are gentle, spreading over weeks and months, and measured as tiny residuals in the orbit fits. Those nudges cannot turn a steeply inclined newcomer into a companion on demand. Even a rough back-of-the-envelope shows the delta V needed would overshoot the small, steady pushes we actually infer for 3I Atlas by orders of magnitude, which is another way the sky says, "not that one," without raising its voice or breaking the calm of the page. Coincidence is common when surveys are alert. New objects arrive in clusters because our attention is heightened, our software tuned, and our follow-ups quick. Pattern-hungry minds like to knit threads between simultaneous headlines, and sometimes those threads are real. Often they are not. The scientific habit here is to pose the connection as a testable claim. Are the orbital planes near? Are the nodes close in space and time? Is the minimum distance between the tracks small? And then, to move the idea to the margin when the answers say no in 3 tidy rows, leaving curiosity satisfied and rumor without new fuel. It helps to return to the data that belongs to our traveller. The Nordic frame after perihelion showed a sunward elongation alongside a fainter anti-solar lean, and observers logged both angles with care. The November 8th stack from 3 images set several narrow brightenings around the core, like fine pencil lines over wash, steady across the combined set within processing limits. Those are the entries that matter for this ledger. They are the kinds of repeated, gentle clues that December's spectra, photometry, and continued position tracking can braid into answers, while side stories float by like harmless flotsam and then drift beyond the pier lights where the water goes quiet again. So we let the extra name slip back into its own column and keep our night simple. One visitor, one careful thread of measurements, one calm pace through what we can see and what we can bound. If another object shares the season, it can keep us company without sharing our plot. That is a kindness to the sky and to our sleep. And as the instruments hum and the stars keep their slow, unbothered drift, we'll let this chapter end the way starlight lingers on a window after the lamp is out, soft enough to see by, quiet enough to forget. December 19th is the quiet center of the calendar, a date that invites steadiness. On that night, the traveler makes its nearest pass to Earth for this visit, about 269 million kilometers away, far, but close enough to sharpen our tools. No one needs to hurry. We will simply watch with the instruments that rest best in winter, and let their strengths overlap. Think of it as walking to a window on a clear evening, not to press your face to the glass, but to see a landscape come into focus because the air finally cooled and stilled, and let the distant ridge show its fine line again. Imaging first, because a picture can hold a room in a soft way. Hubble's eyes, above the weather, draw clean points, and let us track the comet itself so the starfield becomes gentle streaks while the halo keeps its shape. JWST listens in the infrared. Dust scatters differently there, and warmth gives away structures that visible light sometimes hides. Between them, we can compare the inner glow across colors, looking for a firm point at the center, small differences in texture, and any slender filaments that stay narrow over hours, instead of breathing outward, like smoke under a lamp, so that geometry turns into evidence rather than impression. Spectroscopy is the patient hand that opens the light. Split into lines, it tells us which molecules sing, and how fast the gas moves where it starts. The method is unhurried. We will measure widths and shifts, and ask whether they stay in the thermal ranges that warmed ice prefers. If some lines sit broader, or step to speeds that drift away from gentle heating, we will mark those places in the ledger and return with repeat looks, letting chemistry and motion argue softly until a pattern stays long enough to be trusted. Photometry is the pulse. A steady rise and fall in brightness marks rotation, the way a lighthouse repeats at a measured pace. Short glints are possible. They can mean a fresher patch turning to face the sun, or a narrow plume briefly aligned with our sight. Overnights, a clean period anchors many questions. Which face warms first, whether narrow threads brighten on schedule with the spin, and how the coma's rhythm agrees with spectra and images, so the whole score reads like one piece, played by several quiet sections that hear one another and keep time together. Astrometry is the ruler you trust, even when the desk is crowded. We place tiny marks on the sky, night after night, and see whether the path bends by, more than gravity would bend it alone. Changes need not be large. A single small push, sustained for days, tells a clear story in the mathematics. If the accelerations remain steady and point where sunlight would ask natural vents to point, confidence rises. If they twitch in directions that ignore the sun and arrive in steps rather than tides, we make a separate note and sit with that too, until repetition and cross-checks either fold it into the ordinary or hold it apart as a special line to follow. Radar is a long shot at this distance, and still it is worth a word. Planetary radars are powerful, but echoes fade quickly across hundreds of millions of kilometers. A whisper would be a triumph. If an experiment is attempted, even a non-detection refines expectations for surface roughness and size. And should a trace return, it could set a bound on the nucleus's scale, offer a hint about rotation, and tell us whether the core is smooth or pebbled in a way that light alone finds hard to judge, when a bright halo wraps the source in a gauze that kindly hides details from busy eyes. The control rooms keep their low lamps. Someone steps outside and hears Frost talk softly through grass. A faint electric buzz shares the hour with the far murmur of highway tires. Distantly, a kettle clicks. The night holds still enough that you can feel your breath slow to match the instrument's cadence, and the windows show the same star patterns they have shown to careful people for 100 winters running. The plan, then, is as simple as it is complete. Use the week-around closest approach to layer images, spectra, light curves, and position marks until the separate threads agree on what they see. No single measurement decides the night. Agreement does, and agreement grows with repetition. When the date has passed, and the data lie on the same table, we will read them at the pace of the season, carefully, kindly, with the soft assurance that the sky is not trying to surprise us so much as to reward our patience. And we will let the chapter end with the gentle sound the room makes when everyone exhales together and the door closes without a latch. Science decides softly when it is doing its best. Hypotheses enter the room as guests, and the measurements decide who stays for tea. We ask each idea to make small, testable promises. Then we check whether those promises hold when the weather changes, and another instrument takes a turn. A conclusion, when it arrives, feels less like a drumbeat and more like a chair that has been in the same place long enough that everyone stops wondering if it will wobble. Transparency is part of that calm. Observations flow through pipelines built for care, then into archives where many hands can weigh them. Teams publish notes so others can repeat the steps and meet the same horizon. Agencies share advisories, set schedules, and explain what will be measured, when, and why. The point is not speed, but clarity, because clear steps let a result be ordinary even when the sky it describes is rare. Community makes the field wider and slower in the best way. Professionals guide facilities, write proposals, and tune the instruments until the noise falls. Skilled amateurs keep nightly watch, stack frames, log angles, and catch the small changes that fill gaps between large telescopes. Together, they form a long baseline of attention that a single team couldn't hold alone. When a picture, a light curve, a line profile all rhyme across that many eyes, confidence becomes something you feel in your breathing, rather than something you have to announce. we use careful words for the kinds of knowing we accept. Observed is a line you can point to twice, from two places, on two nights, with the same meaning intact and the same numbers within their quiet bounds. Inferred is a line that rests on a model whose assumptions have been stated plainly and checked for sensitivity to the choices we made. Speculative is an arrow drawn in pencil at the edge of the page to remind us where our curiosity points next, and the arrow only comes inside the margin when new notes make it unnecessary to call itself a hope anymore. This vocabulary is not ceremony, it is a blanket we share, so everyone rests at the same temperature while we sit with the sky. Hype is loud, evidence is patient. A radio line that fits Water's Child is chemistry singing, not a voice from a craft. A sunward brightening is an angle to log before it is anyone's engine to name. A small acceleration means a push, not a purpose. When we keep the nouns small and the verbs precise, the story holds together long enough for sleep to find you while the numbers keep working in the next room. What evidence sounds like at the end is repetition without strain. The same angles showing up in new frames, the same speeds in lines taken a week apart, the same gentle drift in position that multiple teams can fit with the same small terms. It is the hush of a control room where a plot matches the last one and no one needs to raise their voice. It is a ledger that fills by habit and a field that thanks many quiet hands. It is a night that ends, not with an answer shouted, but with the soft click of a notebook closing because the page for today is complete. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. We walked a quiet path together, following what has been seen and gently set down. A July image from orbit showed a soft halo and the first hint of a sunward lean. In early October, Mars became our sideways seat, with orbiters watching as the traveller crossed that different sky. China's Tianwen-1 shared a calm frame. Europe's spacecraft listened in turn. The thread stayed unbroken while Earth waited for glare to ease. November brought texture. On the 8th, 3 images stacked their night into a hushed portrait with several slender brightenings around the core. On the 11th, the Nordic Telescope found the motif again, a sunward elongation beside a weaker anti-solar lean in the same field. The centre held as one point. The embroidery kept its form. Another whisper arrived by radio. Lines where Water's Child sings rose above the floor, saying simply that water was there and that chemistry was doing its quiet work. Numbers stayed modest. Patience kept its place. Now the calendar's soft centre waits. Around December 19th, the closest approach comes at a roomy distance, enough for careful eyes to gather what they need. Hubble will sketch the inner glow, while JWST listens for warmth. Spectrographs will weigh speeds. Photometry will keep the pulse. Astrometry will draw the path, night by night, looking for small pushes that repeat. Through it all, we let observations be ordinary, and let meaning assemble itself without hurry. Repetition will do the lifting. Agreement will do the rest. You have done enough for one night. Set the phone aside. Let the shoulders drop. I'll keep the watch with the instruments while you sleep. May the room stay cool, the horizon clear, and the morning arrive kindly. Let the house be quiet now. Good night.